Yeah, so I'll kick it off. So today we're speaking with Casey Handmer. He's been a physicist, an engineer, entrepreneur, really sort of exploring the future for humanity as far as like how we deal with energy, the environment, and quite a lot of technologies. So currently he's occupied as the founder of Terraform Industries, and they're working for to do basically direct air capture to convert hydrocarbons or to create hydrocarbons from atmospheric CO2. And they've done a ton of other work. We'll start digging into some of that. In the past, he was at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, working on GPS science, autonomous systems for Mars exploration. And yeah, he's covered so many topics around space exploration, solar, the future of sort of space colonization. Hopefully, we'll be able to touch on a number of these topics. So Casey, thanks for joining us. I guess, I've seen a lot of interviews with you that touch on many of the sort of higher level philosophical ideas and everything. I'd love to just start maybe on a very different angle and go with, you've talked a lot about doing these hard tech startups and creating progress. What is like the day-to-day life like, right? Like I think a lot of people will hear about things and it's like, oh yeah, solar energy, and we look at cost curves and that's all cool and like exciting. But like for a lot of people, especially people who are like in the progress studies community, I think the actual just day-to-day life would be something fascinating to learn a little bit more about.
That's a good question. I mean, it's always fairly frantic for me personally. I have a young family and home obligations and a commute and all the rest. But it's a real great privilege to be able to build a team of super smart people who are well aligned and enjoying themselves working on important problems. And every day you just kind of get to do that. Um, there's just this morning I checked my email inbox and it's like, oh, I've got to fix my bank and I've got to fix a credit card and I've got to fix some government related stuff. And it's just that stuff usually I don't look forward to, but it has to be done. But I mean, you kind of have to do that whatever you're doing, right? You always have to organize your taxes. So yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Is there anything like you've learned about the process of innovation, progress from the hands-on side, right? So actually trying to build these things, iterating, et cetera, that maybe is not obvious from the outside, like if you're just reading papers, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you're curious in the answer to this question in the context of potentially running your own companies, there are aspects of organizational development that are extremely intuitive once you have done it and completely incomprehensible even as like a manager or something in another organization who like routinely reads business books. Like I'd read The Hard Thing About Hard Things and Zero to One and all the rest before I got started here. And a lot of the advice there was like, this is obvious. Why am I reading a book about this? And now I'm in the hot seat myself. I'm like, oh, what they're saying is not obvious. I just completely misinterpreted what they were saying. It's really hard to communicate about. And so just to kind of make that concrete for a second, uh, it's always been obvious to me that organizations that do a bad job of hiring and firing have a hard time. But I'm still learning just how important it is to ensure that the people who are showing up to work actually want to be there, and how unwilling people are to resign if they're unhappy, and stuff like that. Um, which is Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You can spend an hour a week with someone giving a pep talk on how to do their job and so on, but at the end of the day, the durable effect on the company's culture from doing that will be rounds to zero. Whereas if you have a team of 20 people and you just kind of routinely remove the lowest performer, it has a market effect. Um, and I visited Starbase just last weekend, and it finally twigged that like Elon, who's kind of built the SpaceX organization, with a lot of his team members, obviously, but it's not just that he's really smart and has technical intuition and he's good at picking talent, and he's good at telling the talent how he wants them to go and solve the problem and so on. But SpaceX as an organization has been built as a filter that perpetuates itself by propagating internal memes that are conducive to success and deleting ones that are not. And so you look at the senior managers across SpaceX, for example, you say, wow, what an incredible team. How did Elon know that these were the right people to hire when he hired them straight out of school? The answer is, of course, he didn't. He hired lots and lots and lots of people. Then he built an organization where the best people would rise to the top. And that's what we have today. So there's something to that. And the funny thing about that is it's very at odds with kind of conventional wisdom in software startup land, where I think there's kind of some aspects of physical reality that apply in computers that are a bit different to hardware reality that mean that you can afford to take some shortcuts that really don't work in hardware land.
Can you unpack that last point a little bit? I don't think I entirely follow it, but it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on computers by any means, but computers exist in our physical reality, but within a computer system, it's a world of logic. And if you just kind of write down the minimal set of equations that govern what goes on inside a computer, it's like a completely different universe, right? It's a different set of physical laws. And yes, those physical laws are instantiated in silicon that exists in our universe, but the whole point of digital computers is they don't have the same issues. And so, for example, you can do essentially instantaneous, essentially free, essentially perfect copies, unlimited copies of entities over and over and over again. Not something you can do in reality. And that means that you do want to pursue a different strategy, both in terms of abstractions, like symbolic layers of abstraction and so on, and in terms of mass production of code, in terms of your sales strategy across the organization, in terms of how you fund startups, in terms of how you identify potential founders, in terms of how you evaluate incipient businesses for high quality. And you can port some aspects of that culture into hardware land, but mostly you can't. Because even with 3D printers, you can't do instantaneous, flawless, zero cost copies, marginal copies of your product, which means your distribution channel into the market has to be much more focused on delivering quite large amounts of value to a much smaller number of customers, for example. But it's an interesting puzzle. And of course, you and I, human beings, live mostly in the physical world. So if we want to have cool lives, we've got to figure this one out.
Yeah, I think I was most interested in the organizational implications there, in terms of how maybe a software
Mm,
startup, in terms of hiring organization, would be have different incentive structure, etc.
yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think I have much to add here compared to say Paul Graham, but it's quite clear that in startup land, in software startup land, the returns are very power law distributed, and so it's very hard for us to make useful statistical inferences on what strategies actually succeed because there's just a little bit of noise contributes to a lot of mess in the signal when you crank it up to some enormous power, right? It's the opposite of annealing. So so you can say, well, Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple became extremely successful. What do those companies have in common? Can we cargo cult that into our own startup? But I don't know of any company that has successfully gotten big by copying what some other successful company did in terms of the external cultural artifacts of that company. Whereas I do know of hundreds of companies that are like, oh, we'll be googly, we'll we'll have our own like internal software development processes, and we'll have like bold primary color based branding and like free lunches and like, but that's cargo culting, right? That doesn't actually necessarily get you any closer to success. In order to do something like Google, you have to build the AdWords engine that then becomes just an unlimited gold mine. And it doesn't really matter what you do on top of that. You could run that company any which way you like, and it would it would be just fine. Um, so in terms of structure, kind of broadly speaking, I think in Silicon Valley, there's I can't remember who called it this, but it was like Silicon Valley Inc. or something. And yes, there's tens of thousands of companies, and they'll have corporate structures and ownership patterns and all kinds of stuff. But at the end of the day, it kind of functions as this one kind of giant semi-decentralized organism where you've got a venture capital layer and a GP layer and an angel layer and customer layers and developer layers and sales layers and all the rest. And it's people talk about like San Francisco and kind of unconventional social relationships and stuff there with polyamory and whatnot. But it's actually like that's just an extension of what goes on in the business world there, which is that all of these players between all these companies are more or less interchangeable and are more or less interchanging all the time between different companies, diffusing ideas. It's a very, very powerful model, right? But it also means that like these companies are not culturally all that different to each other. And it also means that the people who specialize in investing in these companies are investing based on heuristics that are good enough that in a software world where the cost of failure is pretty low and the cost of pivoting is also pretty low, and you kind of keep on trying things until you succeed. There's a lot of alpha in that, right? And so we've seen like a number of very, very successful venture capital firms, for example, like basically function as the capital allocation layer in this space, which at least Y Combinator people would tell you comes down to picking some founders and just letting them do their thing. And I think that's probably 90% of it. Um, but there's no such model in hardware, right? We do have historical examples of successful hardware development projects, both government and privately led, and some of those date back to the 1800s, and they have certain patterns that seem quite different to Silicon Valley Inc. Um, and in particular, the capital allocation layer appears to almost always occur within an organization rather than above the organization. So instead of having like a dedicated um, venture class who might make 100 or a couple of hundred deals a year, essentially seeding hundreds of promising ideas, you have a very headstrong founder. And actually, I would put Apple and Amazon, as well as obviously the Elon industrial complex, into this class as well, because there's very rigorous hardware-based aspects of those businesses that suffer hardware-based scaling issues. Um, and I guess Google also has a hardware, although like a hardware aspect, although it's largely segregated from the customer. Um, but in any case, Google's goldmine is not hardware oriented, whereas Amazon makes its money doing hardware for people. Um, so the upshot there is that the capital allocation is not occurring in some sort of specialized VC class, but it's happening at the layer of a much smaller number of founders and their senior lieutenants, and then their friends and colleagues in the finance industry, but not necessarily the venture industry. So for example, Henry Kaiser, who I've been doing a deep dive on now for a couple of months, became very, very close with the senior leadership across several generations of what was then the Bank of Italy, but has since renamed itself to the Bank of America. Um, and yeah, and they lent money to Henry Kaiser for his road building projects, and then they lent money to him for his Hoover Dam, and continue to lend money to him, basically all the way until the bitter end, in the late 60s when he finally died. And so that's it's kind of borrowing money and paying back, and very much later on he got into like IPOs and public markets and stuff like that. But it's a very different business model. But capital allocation is not just deciding what you spend money on, like what projects, what ideas are worthy. And there's some articles out there, I don't mean to name names, but like Breakthrough has put money into about 100 companies, and there are some articles that go through those companies in fine grained detail and say, well, 50% of these companies are less like dead on arrival. There's no chance that what they're trying to do can possibly succeed. And not everyone knows everything about everything, but I think that's probably fair, without specifying which 50 companies. But it's just a hard problem. It's a very hard problem to like form a thesis in hardware and then allocate a bunch of money and not lose your shirt. Whereas if you're the founder yourself, then obviously there's much closer alignment there. And also you live and breathe this stuff. Like I've worked in this field for 3 years now, and I know more about using cheap solar to do cheap industrial processes than probably anyone else has ever known or even considered that it was possible to know. Simply because if you're obsessed with the subject for 3 years, you end up learning a lot about it. Okay, but the other aspect of capital allocation, so it's not just deciding what ideas are worth spending money on, right, and what ideas are not worth spending money on, or deciding how you go about spending money on those ideas, right? So you can say, well, it's a valid idea, but it's still possible to burn $1 billion and get nowhere on it. And we've seen this over and over again with companies that were kind of founded or started up by SpaceX alumni who went out to do launch companies, basically copying the Falcon 1 and still failed. Like figuring out how to do it the first time was the hard part. They've already done that. I don't understand why, like Astra, for example, or I don't want to name too many other companies. Firefly, for example, I think Firefly is actually still around, but 100 or so companies went out in the space and didn't make it. Virgin Orbit, for example. But capital allocation also includes allocating human capital, right? It turns out that it's not enough to have the right amount of money working on the right ideas with the right style. You have to have the right people working on it, and that is also, I think much less interchangeable than in software, particularly in the post-LLM world.
No, this is wonderful. This is touching on a lot of the questions I had in my mind of sort of what are the core bottlenecks in hardware right now? Like what are the fundamental limits or limitations on seeing this scale up? Given that, software industry has had, a number of decades to really build that out.
Yeah,
So
I have some thoughts on bottlenecks, unless you want to dive into like more specific prompts.
I do want to hear a little bit more on bottlenecks. I don't want to burn all our time on it, but it's like a
Okay.
really fascinating
Yeah. Sorry.
topic to think about because no one like writes about it, right? Like there's lots of books
Yeah.
in the software industry. I find it
Yeah.
very hard to learn a lot about the hardware side of the world.
Okay. So again, this is just my personal perspective, man. Uh, if Henry Kaiser was able to build the Hoover Dam in 1938, in like the middle of the Great Depression, right? But there's no camera. Like if Weimar Germany was able to build the Haber-Bosch and the Fischer-Tropsch processes in like the 1930s in like hyperinflation Germany, like it is not the case that you do not have enough capital to solve this problem. And everyone who's complaining about valley of death, it's cope. What you need to do is figure out how to generate money and have your unit economics work at a smaller scale. That's the hard part. I think it's also not the case that like there's somehow a shortage of educated people or something like that. I think everything is pushing in our favor today in 2025 versus 100 years ago when it comes to doing epochal hardware projects. And I think that Elon understood that and he went and built Tesla and SpaceX to show that it was possible. And I think plenty of people would say he has his detractors and would say he made a lot of mistakes there, and he certainly did, but they still succeeded, right? Like where they would not have succeeded in the 1970s. The key thing that's missing is people deciding that it is prestigious enough to do a difficult, risky hardware task that they're prepared to devote 5 years of their lives to making a go of it, right? And 50 years ago, the Rockefellers of this world, they didn't have the option to take the easy route through SaaS. If they wanted to do something big and build an empire, they had to actually go and like monopolize an industry, ideally invent first and then monopolize an industry. And that's kind of the key, right? It takes a certain level of bloody-mindedness. And many people have commented that it seems to be more common in immigrants. Or like first or second generation immigrants, and you see that again with the founders of Google and Jeff Bezos and Elon and so on and so forth. It really helps to have a big chip on your shoulder. So, well, like Palmer for that matter. Palmer's not an immigrant, but he has a big chip on his shoulder. Yeah, because there's a lot of easy money out there, and like hardware is a get rich slowly maybe program, but it's also real wealth. Like if you build an army of 1,000 people who can build stuff that no one else can build, that's a moat. Like holy shit. Anyway, go on.
I I love that answer. It's very interesting to think about. Essentially, that it falls very much in line with a lot of the narratives, right? Where software got too easy, and so it sort of distracted in some sense. The prestige element is very interesting. Um, yeah, I think you've touched on a number of things. I was really curious on this topic. One area I'd love to, you already alluded to a little earlier, but where do you see the equilibrium playing out as we get more and more access to um, AI for virtual smarts, combined with robotics, right? There's all this push for humanoid robots. This will be some major force in the economy, as a lot of people trying to predict out. Does that favor the incumbents where they can just dump more capital in it? Is it the incumbent, the people who want to chew glass now have an easier time, so that will help them? How do you see that playing out? Particularly say in the space of solar or around where Terraform is. But I'm happy to
Good
see
question.
your thoughts anywhere, really.
I don't really have a good answer on that. I would say that over time tooling improves and that permits layers of abstraction. And this is very, very clear analogy in software. So if you are a person in a hurry nowadays, you will instruct your LLM to write Python code that will then be interpreted before it eventually becomes zeros and ones on the computer. And it's just not worth your time to be fucking around with zeros and ones. It's just not. It helps if you have a basic idea what's going on if you're trying to do some like crazy debugging. But yeah, I think like the alpha in being, well, I don't know. Like my expectation is like the LLMs should improve your productivity drastically. Now, one of the nice things about software is it's like infinite elasticity, right? No amount of software will saturate demand. But at the same time, you should expect like the marginal benefits of producing additional software uh, to taper off in proportion to the amount that you're able to generate, if that makes any sense. Like just because an LLM makes you 100 times more productive, I would not expect your wage to go up by a factor of 100. Possibly your value generation could if you were ingenious enough. Um, but yeah, capturing that is a different question. As far as hardware goes, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit when it comes to plugging software into legacy hardware processes. We haven't really bothered to do that at Terraform for a number of reasons. But I think in value-added manufacturing, the number of companies out there that are actually like going like fully hardcore on a software layer that intermediates the design or the buyer and the machinery actually doing the work is a small number. Like I think Hadrian is kind of moving in that direction, but even then, and like Monolith, what are they called? Sorry, Monumental. They're doing like stone carving type stuff. But even then, it's baby steps. It's absolute baby steps. This is like Grace Hopper level like compiler work compared to what we have today. So there's a lot of low hanging fruit there. It would be amazing. It would be amazing if our technology was able to get us to the point where we could file print, right? Any hardware thing we had in mind. But I tell, sorry, you can't even do that with Uh, you can't even do that with a 3D printer. Like it's state of the art 3D printer. There's still a lot of like shit fuckery that goes on just to make it work. But yeah, we'll get there eventually. And that's actually an interesting question. Like some of my friends are like, well, will AI get us to 20% annual economic growth? Yeah, just as an idea, what would that look like? What would the world look like, in that world? And you say, well, probably, you'll end up in a post-scarcity situation where you're saturating demand for a wider range of physical goods, which means that if you want to find growth, you actually have to find ways for humans to consume vastly more stuff somehow. We're pretty much already sated as far as like you and I at least, food, water, internet, heating, cooling in our home spaces, um, automobiles and stuff like that. So like how do we end up consuming 10 times more stuff on a per capita basis? Probably high-speed transportation and like an army of robots would be my guess. But if you're going to go like per capita, per human capita, as opposed to per human level AI capita, I don't really know. There was this kind of thing you touched on a second ago, which is in terms of predictions. Well, predictions are very hard, particularly about the future. It's not clear to me, for example, whether the AI technology that's coming online right now will end up being more useful in terms of bringing most of humanity productivity up, right? Which would be a more egalitarian, more progressive outcome, or whether its advances will continue to be exploited best by the smartest people. In which case you would expect to see an extended stratification of ability, right? It may be a bit of both, but we do end up in a situation where the consumption of a society is determined by the kind of the average or the mean level of productivity in that society, whereas the pricing of goods and services, particularly rivalrous goods that are inherently deflationary, like we've decided not to build housing for 50 years, which is just fucking stupid, but there we are, is set by the median, right? So if you end up with a big deviation between mean productivity and median productivity, such as would be driven by like extremely productive outliers at the extreme upper end of economic productivity, then you'd probably end up in a situation where housing gets significantly less affordable, unless those high productivity people were able to figure out how to break the logjam on building housing, for example. And that's something that I worry about because at the end of the day, housing, I believe, is like overdetermined in terms of like, its impact on affordability generally and its impact on inflation and in particular its impact on birth rates. And it's kind of interesting to think like, will AI kill us all by pushing our birth rate to zero by making housing unaffordable, or will it kill us all by paving our farms with solar panels to feed itself? And it's kind of one or the other.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I was very interested to hear because there's an argument where you start getting enough automation of robotics where robots are installing solar panels, robots are building our houses, that sort of thing, as one version of
Yeah,
that.
we're
Again,
not labor constrained on housing construction, just to be clear.
I'm sorry?
We're not labor constrained on housing construction or solar panel construction for that matter. We are governance constrained, right? It's a
Okay.
choice. We're not short of wood to build houses, right? Like we we've just decided to make it extremely difficult, approximately impossible, approximately illegal to build. And that's a decision. But it's 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 an awkward case of a decision that's driven by some kind of like weird collective process where no one's really in control. And there are very nasty externalities that are very kind of long-term brewing. And we don't really have good models for how to fix that within a democratic system, which is a challenge. Um, anyway,
So is that your bear case then on solar?
well, it's a pain in the ass for me right now because it slows me down deploying solar for my company. But at least with solar, like if it takes 2 to 3 years, you will eventually get it on the ground. So it's just a matter of slowing down deployment. But on housing, at least, like it's I live in a neighborhood where like some houses burned down a couple like last month. Um, but the housing stock in my neighborhood was mostly built in the 50s. So these are houses that were built, let's say, to a budget in a great hurry 70 years ago that are like completely non-compliant with current codes and they're too small and they are like 50% termites by weight and it is functionally illegal to replace them. And we will end up in a situation where my neighborhood is my city is like 3,500 structures and we're building about 10 new structures a year. So on average, the housing stock will age to until it's 400 before it's replaced, which is stupid, obviously. Anyway, grump, grump, grump.
No, thank you. This is very interesting to hear. Sort of, so I'd like to step back just a bit because I love how you think about problems and how you approach them. And over your career, you've touched on so many very different areas, right? Where you're starting in physics and working on black holes. You're working on some stuff with Hyperloop for a bit, NASA JPL. So how have you like approached each of those problems? You've talked a lot about approaching solar and like why Terraform is such a great idea, but I'd love to just get some of your like mindset philosophy, how you think about picking these big problems.
Um, I think it's just like look shiny object. Yeah, I don't think there's a broader strategy. I would suggest that um, switching fields every few years is something that I've kind of found myself having to do for a variety of reasons, but it's not necessarily a good way to accumulate wealth and expertise, to put it mildly. If you want to be old and rich like Warren Buffett, you have to accumulate for a very long time. And it's not the case that you reset to zero when you switch fields, but you do take a big hit.
I'd love to hear, so you've talked a lot about solar, and it's very, I think everybody just gets super excited reading your work about it, often with space. Is there anything that you're starting to mull over of like another mid to long term kind of horizon excitement, as opposed to the like, what's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years or 10 years, say?
Well, I mean, solar is the thing that unlocks cheap, like durably and predictably cheaper energy forever for humanity. And that's, I think, massively underpriced. The other thing that I'm obsessed with, of course, is space exploration, um, which is in some sense decoupled from solar. But I spend an awful lot of cycles thinking about that. In terms of other big things to build businesses around, well, the thing is, like when something like solar comes along, I wrote a blog post about this last year. It provides an opportunity to essentially like scramble the shuffle the deck and or scramble the board or whatever, and that gives you the chance to I don't know, like if you're like, well, I think that I would like to be involved in the cement industry, but the cement industry, at least in the Western world, is controlled by 7 family-owned businesses. And how are you going to get in on that? They run fully amortized plants that are close to their markets of interest at extremely low cost. But something like solar actually gives you a lever by which you can change that, right? Whereas like, how are you going to pry Google out of its perch on AdWords? It might be running AdWords in 1,000 years. It can't happen unless some major technology shift occurs underneath their feet that they can't deal with. Um, and so that's kind of what you have to look for if you want to go and grab a big chunk of something. But yeah, there's so many cool things out there to do. I mean, at Terraform right now, we're spending a fair bit of time looking at things beyond synthetic fuels because we don't just use cheap energy to make, well, we don't just use fuels to make cheap energy and vice versa. We also use cheap energy for all our materials. So, cement's one of them, obviously, but we got to get a lot smarter about how we make metals. Like, still like, Oog walk around in the desert for a while until he finds shiny rock. Like, make shiny rock really hot. Now I have metal. Like, probably do better than that.
I don't want to completely fill the whole time or like leave people only a few minutes at the end. So before I keep going on like another topic, does anyone else have other questions they'd love to jump in with?
Yeah, totally. Hey, Casey, it's good to see you.
Right.
Um, One of the things that I've been curious about is like the state of American manufacturing. Like how much of what you're doing is you try to find a supplier and you can't, and so you have to make it yourself versus you're sticking together stuff that's kind of off the shelf, specifically for Terraform, the Terraformer.
That's a good question. Yeah, so when it comes to manufacturing, um, if you're in a capital constrained business, right? So that's not really the case if you're making iPhones, right? There's a nice big margin there. But if you're making cars, so Tesla's case, or in our case, Terraformers, the margins are going to be pretty slim. And so if you have like a network of manufacturers you're working with doing sub-assemblies and stuff, you're splitting the pie with them, and that's going to hurt you. So so in our case, like we have to in-house the custom manufacturing in order to retain that value and also control over the process. We don't make our own pencils though. So like if you can just buy
Right.
it off the shelf,
You should.
if it's a fungible supply chain, right? There's like multiple suppliers who are all producing it, right? You should take advantage of commodified complements. Um, but US manufacturing, it is it has now become quite obvious to all the people involved that China has leapfrogged us with their special economic zone in the Shenzhen area and other parts of China as well. But essentially, like if you have a dense, growing city with a lot of talent moving around and so on, sharing ideas, creating ideas, then you can create an ecosystem of competitive manufacturers. But as soon as like an industry, so like pick Detroit, for example, as like a car town, as soon as that car manufacturing industry reaches maturity and its explosive growth phase slows down or stops, then it's very hard to maintain the health of that ecosystem and the competitiveness. And you end up with basically like power centers that are left over fighting over the spoils. And in the case of Detroit, I think the unions had a role to play in basically turning the economics of that system upside down with predictable and now well-known consequences. So the question I think we have to ask ourselves is like, how quickly can we catch up and then overtake what China is doing? If the Chinese can do it, like if you're an entrepreneur, would you rather start a company in the United States or in China? Right? Like, obviously United States. I don't want to spend 20 hours a week studying Xi Jinping thought. So like, I should start in the United States. So like, it's pretty obvious that there are fairly substantial political headwinds to any Chinese entrepreneurial effort, and yet these people are still destroying us. It's not like they have infinitely cheap labor or no environmental laws either. I think it's just a matter of like bloody-minded determination to make it happen.
Is the weapons industry in LA eternal enough and vast enough to keep that going, or would you need a diversity of industries like going beyond cars in Detroit?
Well, LA has been an aerospace town for about 100 years, but has gone through many cycles of boom and bust. I think until SpaceX kind of got cooking, it was really in a period of long secular decline. There used to be multiple independent aircraft manufacturers based in Los Angeles. Now there are none. Like Douglas, McDonnell, gone. General Dynamics, I think, was bought up. There was in the 90s, there was a series of big mergers. Just across the road from us here, there used to be a Lockheed plant that produced probably 100,000 aircraft over the course of its life. It's completely gone. There's still a handful of companies here that do like aluminum parts and stuff, but it's a shadow of its former self. We can rebuild it, but you need a persistent source of demand.
That's curious. If you were to put into buckets roughly, how many parts are you totally just getting off the shelf versus you could get off the shelf, but you don't trust the supply chain versus you just have to manufacture them yourself? Is it like vastly different proportions?
Oh yeah, because the off-the-shelf stuff is small, and so you buy a lot of them. There's not actually, in terms of stuff that we could buy, not off the shelf, but like pay some other contractor to build for us. Basically, none of it's affordable, so we have to make it ourselves, right? So okay, I want to buy this widget that I need to make my machine work, and it's going to take 2-year lead time, and it's going to cost 10 times too much. Like, no, you just have to in-house it.
Just build in-house.
That's the nature of the beast. It's exactly the same thing. You can read the books about SpaceX's early history when they're like, I think one of the local contractors quoted them like $5 million in a year to build a thrust vector controller for Falcon 1, and Elon said, it's about as complicated as a garage door opener.
Right.
Gave it to an intern, and they had a working prototype in 6 weeks.
Yeah.
So like, there's a surprising amount of stuff like that, where especially if you have a modicum of like mechanical intuition, or you're prepared to do the hard work to develop it, which basically involves crawling around under cars until your hands bleed.
Right.
You can actually find shortcuts like that all the time. Actually, one thing I would say is like the AIs, at least the AIs I have access to, are shit at that. They're not good at all. They're just dismal. That said, if you show up for an interview at Terraform, speaking of which, you and please your smart friends, send them my way. We are hiring like crazy right now. We had a candidate come in last week, unfortunately, well, I mean, it was fortunate. He's a nice enough guy, but I think he misunderstood the prompt, because if you show up with a prepared question and your answer is worse than what the LLM can deliver, I really have to wonder, like, why didn't you ask the AI first? You've got to ask the AI, reach that level, and then go beyond it.
Yeah.
It's completely expected to use tools that are available to you.
Totally. That makes sense. It almost seems like what you're saying is that we're almost too early to have a fragmented, robust set of contractors for all these parts, because we don't even know what we want until after the products are built.
Well, I said first up, like verticalization is the key around these new products, right? And if you if you end up having like 2 or 3 major companies all making the same kinds of things in Detroit or whatever,
Right.
Chicago, um, making cars, then yeah, at that point you can start to horizontalize and have say,
Right.
we'll have there'll be a company that like someone leaves and they set up a company that specializes in making upholstery for cushions or something. And at that point, you can argue that like, okay, they have a bit of competitive advantage, and we have very predictable flow of cushions, and we don't expect much innovation on that front. So we're happy to lose control of that process to other people. But you don't have to read a Harvard Business School review of like what happened at Boeing to realize that outsourcing the production of the 787 to 55 separate subcontractors was a massive mistake.
Right.
Like Epochal like should have destroyed the company, but Airbus also made a huge fuck up at the same time, level mistake. They budgeted $5 billion to develop the 787, and it cost them $55 billion. I don't know if they've even made money on the project yet. It's a huge mistake. And
Right.
I was just like trying to save some money and trying to get around some union issue. And yeah, the unions can be a pain in the ass, but there are ways of solving union problems without like divesting your entire company.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious. I've heard from watching hardware startup folks that everybody says the same thing, which is the interfaces in your organization become the interfaces in your product.
Mm-hmm.
So I know SpaceX basically like breaks it up where there are natural interfaces for the product to help break up the organization. Do you have
Yep.
like a process for that, or is it pretty much just go, go, go? Okay, things are not, interfacing properly. Let's reorganize.
That's a great question. I think I wrote something about this a couple of months ago. But yeah, I'm kind of obsessed with failure modes of organizational inefficiency, having
Right.
been afflicted by them for most of my life. Um, but at SpaceX, actually, they don't really have interfaces per se. The interfaces are fuzzy, and that's deliberate. They want people treading on each other's toes. So
Yeah.
like instead of being like, oh, we better spend 3 months defining an interface control document,
Sure.
for how the thrust puck attaches to the or whatever it's called, the I think it's the thrust puck attaches to the rest of the tank. Let's have those people sit near each other and they say, oh yeah, we're not going to define it, you guys figure it out, right? And it's a bit of
Right.
push, give and take. In our case, our products are relatively small and discrete, and my intention, which I've thus far enforced, is that instead of having like a design team, an analysis team, a manufacturing team, a legal team, blah 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 blah, and have these people like on Slack bouncing messages back and forth between each other all day, which from the outside does not increase the GDP of your company, right? It's just
Yes.
internal consumption. We have a dedicated verticalized team that's just devoted to each of the subsystems. And they all sit near each other, and they share resources occasionally, and we help out each other on reviews and so on, make sure we're not breaking the interfaces. But then it's more of an atelier model, and the advantage of that is that if you're an ambitious engineer or a technician or something, you actually get to work on the whole system from like requirements formulation through to like actually testing it in front of customers and then taking their feedback and like designing the manufacturing fixtures and tooling and going and running the manufacturing line and then like flying out to talk to some vendor or whatever. Like you get to do all of it. Everyone on the team gets to do all of it. And yes, some people on the team have certain strengths in certain areas, but we play musical chairs pretty often in terms of reallocating talent on different projects at different phases within
Makes sense.
teams,
Kind of
just to make sure
forming.
it'd be like
Yeah.
7 or 8 to 10 people on each team. That's about the right size, I think. And beyond that, we might look at further fragmenting them. But the interfaces are very straightforward for us. It's like the hydrogen machine makes hydrogen. The output is like mostly pure hydrogen. As long as it's mostly pure hydrogen, the person downstream will be able to deal with it. And you just keep it sensible that way.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. I have more questions about NASA, but if anyone wants to talk about stuff still
Don't get me started on NASA. That'll use all the time.
That's why I stopped.
Such a waste of opportunity. My God.
Yep.
I mean, I guess I'll ask the question I was going to ask around these topics anyway, and it does touch on the NASA part, but just like our organization's just kind of doomed over a reasonable timeline. Like it seems that's kind of the core takeaway here, right? Like Elon Musk helps things work because he filters, but if he weren't there, maybe not, that would persist.
It does seem to be the case that companies on the S&P 500 only are there for a generation or two. And it does seem that large organizations built by singular founders are often fucked up by their children or grandchildren.
Yeah.
And I think the question of like organizational maintenance or renewal is a complicated one. So like Ford is still around, but it's a shadow of its former self. It's a tough problem. I think that there's a lot to Paul Graham's recent post on Founder Mode. And we kind of see the same thing with the second generation leadership coming into Google, for example. Like Sundar's a super smart guy, right? And he worked his way up, but at the end of the day, he's a natural number two, I believe. And he hasn't been able to gamble the company in the same way that Larry and Sergey would. And now Gemini's it's the butt of jokes. So it's a bit of a challenge. But one of the things that you do see actually is that when people first achieve wealth and security, they kind of lose their mojo in a way. They're not ready to fight. It's actually very unusual to find people who, having gotten rich, will turn around and throw themselves back into it. And I think that's one of the reasons that Elon is so singular and people don't understand him. And roughly half the country right now is freaking out about what Elon's doing in government. And they're like, if I just say enough mean things about him, he'll stop. Like, no. Like, if your model for Elon is not like this person is the equivalent of a super intelligent AI that is in the process of pursuing its own goals that may or may not conflict with mine. Like if you're like, oh, he's stupid and crazy and drug addicted, like your predictions about the world are bad and you're gonna have a bad time. All right. As for NASA, I mean, NASA's got a fabulous brand, doesn't it? And it does have some capabilities I think are worth preserving. But one of the questions I have is like, how deeply are you prepared to cut to save the patient? And I think that in NASA's case, you have to have a Twitter style evisceration. It doesn't mean that everyone has to get fired, but it does mean that nearly everyone has to be reorged at the very least. And it's going to be unpleasant one way or another.
Would you keep the budget the same and just change their role as a capital allocator, or would you completely gut it out?
Well, at the end of the day, I think that Elon and Trump have discovered that like budget is the lever by which you make things you want to have happen. It's called the scream test, right? You say, I don't know who's using this system. We'll turn it off and see who screams. And then cooler heads will say, well, we should have a slow deliberative process to solve these problems. And like the problem is a slow deliberative process will never solve the problems because the problems are a stable attractor of the current slow deliberative process. You actually need to change the fitness landscape around these problems if you want to have any hope of breaking through, very well developed defensive bulwarks that like stop change from occurring. And in NASA's case, I strongly suspect it's something like retire with a good deal, a quarter of the workforce, divest a quarter of NASA's mission to other agencies. So like maybe the aviation part goes over to FAA or something like that, or Department of Energy. Relocate about a quarter. So, again, like I won't write a blog post on this anytime soon, but I think that the Johnson Space Center should be relocated to Brownsville to be closer to where SpaceX is building Starship. And that will have the really good effect of making sure that you're filtering for people who actually care about the mission. Because if they're dedicated to the mission, they'll say, yeah, Brownsville's not that bad. It's still pretty close to Houston. There's good schools there. It's gentrifying like crazy. There's two massive industrial projects occurring there, SpaceX and a big export terminal. This will be a cool place. This is a place to build a future. I'll go there and I'll raise a family and build a community. And the lifers who are like, you know what, I'm like already 75 years old and I'm just flying the space station that's going to crash in a year or two anyway. It's time to bow out. And so you have this process whereby like this calcified management structure can turn over naturally. And then about a quarter of the remainder should be promoted fairly aggressively. I think there's a lot of hidden talent at NASA that's been kept down by kind of seniority-based promotion. Probably should start with that, actually, in terms of the argument. Oh, we're going to promote a bunch of people and also retire a bunch of people. I don't want to single NASA out here. NASA is probably the best run federal bureaucracy, right? So if that's what's necessary to save NASA, I think the thing is that like the success case for NASA is a significantly higher level of agency and performance than most agencies, right? Like if Social Security gets the checks out on time, it's okay, right? But if NASA like manages to put 100 astronauts on the moon, that's okay. So it's like it's a different level of performance that's expected.
Right. Yeah. Do you have any idea whether that's going to happen at all, or if it's
Oh, I don't have any insights. Yeah. I have some friends who work on the inside, but they're all keeping the cards pretty close to the chest as they should. They don't want me to break news on my blog, and I don't want to break news on my blog.
That's true. Yeah, I just think of Jared Isaacman. I'm not sure, what his temperament is going to be or what his directive is going to be.
Well, the nice thing about Jared, well, aside from the fact that he's a really nice guy, is that he's a successful entrepreneur. So he actually knows how successful businesses function in the real world. And the unfortunate thing is like NASA's full of smart, well-intentioned people, but it's blind leading the blind when it comes to understanding like how you achieve a success-based outcome. Not in all, but in many programs. That's blatantly obvious at this point. It's not converging on success.
Right.
The question remains kind of like, everyone starts off with limited stock of political capital, and so like how many unpleasant or unpopular decisions are you prepared to make? That's a challenge. But anyway.
Yeah.
Question? Anyone? I've offended you all.
No, definitely not.
On your website, I see that you are interested in linguistics. Is that still the case? Is that something you spend time on, learning new languages? And if so, how much time do you spend? Oh, not really. Okay.
So that website was probably written 10 years ago. Most of my writing is happening on my blog now. I do update it from time to time, but it's kind of a snapshot in time. I'm very interested in languages, and if I'm traveling to a place, I do make an effort to like get a dictionary and read around the subject a bit. So I was in Bali last summer and I ended up spending a few days like reading about Austronesian linguistics, which was kind of fun. But a couple of years ago, around the same time I became a father, I kind of came to terms with the fact that that some things that there was a dislocation between the things that I thought I enjoyed or that I would enjoy becoming good at, and the things that I actually did enjoy doing and did enjoy becoming good at, as evidenced by what I actually spend my time doing. And it turns out that almost no one has insight into this. Almost no one has insight into where they actually get the dopamine, and that they can have some conscious control over how they train themselves to get dopamine doing certain kinds of activities. And so at this point, I basically came to terms with the fact that, during my undergraduacy many years ago, I became quite good at playing piano. And then in grad school, I did not practice as much as I had, and I wasn't progressing as quickly. And then during COVID, I once again pretty much got to the point where I was, and then decided that that was enough, and I was prepared to basically leave becoming exceptionally good at piano to the professionals. Because at the end of the day, it's an opportunity cost. Are you going to spend 2 hours a day typing like this, playing music, or are you going to spend 2 hours a day like writing blogs and organizing your company and writing coding on computers? And unfortunately, these activities are mutually exclusive because you're using your brain and your hands in much the same way. And I just realized that like I spend most of my time writing goofy code to solve interesting problems because it's a bit more fun than playing piano for me, anyway.
I did want to touch on that topic. You mentioned in your blog about reading the classics in Latin and so forth. What are you most excited about if we could discover it for the Vesuvius challenge?
Oh, hell yeah. Well, I mean, the nice thing about languages actually is that once, at least in my case, once I've learned them, I don't forget them very quickly. So I haven't really done anything with Russian in about 10 years. And it's been almost 20 years 15 years since I was any good at all at it. But I haven't really forgotten it. And the same with Latin. Maybe I was never that good to begin with. But yeah, if we discover a new classic, like a lost classic in Latin, I will definitely be reading it in Latin with an English translation nearby to help if I get stuck. But that'd be freaking amazing. It'd be amazing. One of the things so your mileage may vary, but humans have mirror neuron circuits in their brain that basically run in simulation actions that you see other people doing. And these circuits are activated when you're reading as well. So it turns out that one of the reasons that reading is powerful is that it allows you to like run in emulation, at least to some level of accuracy, the mind state of the author, particularly if they're good at writing. And it gives you insights into what it's like to be inside their brain. And that's one of the really powerful things about reading the classics that have survived. But also the stuff that has not survived is the stuff that I really want to dig into and find out about. Like we know the monks preserved very selectively. They basically didn't preserve deliberately, at least, any female writers or any natural historian writers. So for all we know that there were several women in ancient Rome and ancient Greece who devoted their lives to what we would now call science, observational science primarily, but science. They did some experimentation as well. And we have fragments. We have like less than a tweet of stuff from all these people. Imagine if we found like 10,000 words of like the life cycle of the European sparrow from some ancient female scientist who lived on some island, off the coast of Greece or something. Like absolutely mind blowing. Yeah, looking forward to it.
I just want to double click on it. Is there like what would be your top like one or two or three individual works that, because there's always the unknown unknowns, right? There's lots of works we don't know, but of the ones where we're like we know it exists and we just don't know it. Is there anything on the top of your mind for those?
That's very taste-based thing. We know that Cicero wrote quite a bit about clockwork. Basically, the ancient Greeks in Syracuse, which is now in Sicily. We know that they built things like the Antikythera mechanism, so it'd be pretty cool to find some works on that. It'd be pretty cool to find the missing epics from the Homeric cycle, of which I think we have 2 out of 12. So the Iliad and the Odyssey are 2 out of 12. And we know that those existed in the ancient world. No, but I think the other classicists who have better lists than me. I'll take anything I can get if it's not like boring philosophy by the guy who was working there. Which most of the stuff we found so far appears to be. But like there's almost certainly tens of thousands of scrolls that are still buried that we haven't excavated yet. So it's we got to go in there and get it out.
When
I
are
have
we
a
gonna
question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Please.
So I feel like, so you read all these, biographies from founders, but I feel like there's not really a blueprint, or I don't get an idea of where do people start from? Like, what are the steps in your life when you started Terraform Industries? Like, you had an idea in some way or another, but then what steps did you take? Who did you reach out to? Like, how did you organize your life? Start.
Yeah, I asked a bunch of friends of mine, and they tried to be helpful, and I've read books, and they tried to be helpful, and so on. But to misquote the Matrix, you have to see it for yourself, basically. And the good news is, it's not like getting married to someone you've never met or something. It's like it's relatively low commitment. If you decide you hate it, you can always just wrap up a Delaware C corp for about $1,000 and go back to being a wagey. But it is transformational in that actually most people don't want to do that. They want to make it work, and you will at times stare in the abyss and chew up broken glass and start to enjoy the taste of blood. But it's a little bit like, I don't know if you've ever done this, but when I was 19 or so, I decided I want to go and hitchhike around the world, and by far the hardest single part of that was picking up my backpack and closing my front door behind me. And then 6 steps later I was into it. It was fine, and within a week I was having a great time. And it's a little bit like that too. I mean, I spent a year screwing around in my garage during the zero interest rate phenomenon era, like trying to convince myself that it was worth quitting my like dead end fucked up job at JPL to pursue this. And eventually I did it, but I should have done it a year earlier. I should have been like, this is obviously an idea worth exploring full time. I'm working from home at COVID anyway. I can go and raise a bunch of money right now, so I should do it. So yeah, I would say like it will definitely fuck up your life, but in a good way. So you should do it. It's much less harmful than drugs and alcohol. So it also like it gives you this like it puts you into a very special club, especially if you're doing hardware engineering. Like it's like a couple of dozen people in the States that are doing this. It's a very and they have this in common, and almost no one else does with them. It's a special thing.
I actually wanted to double click on that if oh, God, I hate using that metaphor. Sorry. But anyway,
Let's drill in. Yeah.
How do you start to meet these people, right? Because you said, hey, my friends were all into it, and so I started to get into it. And I know a lot of people, like empirically, inventors tend to spawn inventors. How did you get into that? Was it JPL? Was it something else? I'd be very curious. Or how could other people get into it, I guess is really the question, right? I find it a very compelling space, but I do find myself sitting there going like, well, wait, what's step 0?
What is step 0? Well, at some point I made a list of the friends that I hung out with, and I realized almost all of them are entrepreneurs of one flavor or another. Not all of them are going and doing like big venture-backed companies, but a lot of them run their own podcasts or write books or whatever. So independent creator types. And I was like, there might be something to that. But you kind of, again, to misquote Dune, you have to find your own way to it. There's no one way. But eventually you realize like there's a set of things you want to accomplish in your life, and you're not going to get any closer to them until you actually go and set your own agenda. And in many cases, if you already have like comfortable existence, good job, good easy job, earning good money, it's really hard to overcome that inertia. And Google knows that. Right? They want you to stay there, stay there in the cube eating the bugs, because it makes them money. I had one of my employees just tell me the other day, like, oh, I want to go and start my own thing. And I said, that's a great idea. You should definitely do that. But I'm not done with you yet. So can you please stay here until we've finished extracting value from you? And by the way, here's a YC safe. So when you're ready, we'll put in your first $100,000. And hopefully they stay, because I'm not done extracting the value yet. And then as far as meeting people, it's mostly through X. So X is basically where almost all the, at least the like my generation and younger founders choose to waste their time. I don't think that's particularly surprising. But yeah, once you start doing this and you write some blog posts about it, you'll find your way into that community pretty quickly.
Do you think universities like do a good job at producing talent or in this space?
Do universities do a good job of producing talent in this space? I think getting a degree in entrepreneurship is a total waste of time. If that's the answer to your question. But what universities will do is they'll have you
generally.
Universities will have you rub shoulders with other people who are kind of similar socioeconomic status and smart, and will help you build your network in the future. So when it comes to hiring people, it helps to have gone to university, a bunch of people who are smart, right? And or when it comes to raising money or building a real estate practice, I think it helps to have gone to university with a bunch of people who are like from old money or something like that. It's definitely life on easy mode to spend 4 years like aggressively network building amongst other people who value the same things as you do. You don't have to do it, right? You can just go and do the thing as well. I think that the value of a degree in terms of securing a job in the productive areas of the economy is lower than ever. So you don't need a degree to get a degree in computer science to get a good job at Google. You just need like a half decent GitHub and you can pass the interview. And so, I think in my generation, parents would have said, well, even if you're considering entrepreneurship, get the degree because it'll give you job security in the future. I don't think that's the case anymore, with a handful of narrow exceptions. Obviously, if you want to become a doctor, well, tough luck, self-certifying. And then there's a handful of schools that are still regarded as very strongly meritocratic, and the degrees are actually worth the paper they're printed on. But unfortunately, I'd say 90% of degrees from 90% of schools are not useful to me at all in terms of determining if people are good at their jobs or not. All right, I'm going to have to wrap this up at exactly 10, so you have time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Who has the most burning questions? Go, go, go.
Okay, if you don't have questions, your homework is to go and write down 20 good questions. Holy shit.
No.
I screen almost everyone at Terraform, right? When I'm recruiting, I've screened hundreds of people, probably thousands of people at this point. And the 4th question is always, do you have any questions for me? And it makes a huge difference if you have a good question, like a really good question. And if it's like, no questions, I'm like, holy shit, you have like 5 minutes of time of the CEO of a company that you want to work for, and you don't have a single question about anything, right? Or like, what made you think of this thing? I don't read a blog post.
The question I've wanted to ask you for a while was, in the macro scale, solar sounds great. At the regional scale and the geopolitical scale, that's the thing that I'm very curious about, right? Like the UK, is that going to work for them, or does that?
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think what I'm curious about, I know prediction is hard, so it's maybe not framed in that, but geopolitically, there's a lot of interesting ramifications there, right? In terms of where
absolutely. Yeah, so it turns out that human population patterns mirror almost exactly agricultural productivity patterns before the invention of artificial fertilizer.
Really?
Because, humans grow places, refrigeration. Humans live in places where they're able to grow enough food to survive. They can't carry that food very far.
Yeah.
And humans have not drastically changed the numbers of humans since 100 years ago. Like there's a bit more concentration in cities, but we haven't seen, for example, like the formation of a 100 million person nation on Svalbard since 100 years ago, right? And so that basically means if you live in a place that's able to grow enough food for people to survive, before the invention of industrialized agriculture, where productivity per acre is, let's say, pretty low, the productivity per acre with solar power for electricity is like more than 100 times higher. And even advanced industrial economies today don't consume 100 times more electricity or fuel than they do food. It's roughly 100 in the most extreme cases. So even places that are considered relatively gloomy, like Denmark or Germany or whatever, have easily enough land for all the energy they could possibly want from solar. And the one exception to that is UK, because it's a large industrialized economy that that has kind of grown for many centuries on the back of coal, rather than agriculture in terms of population and also its various colonial holdings. It's not to say that's the end of the line for Britain. They can get serious about nuclear power or wind power, and solar power even works to an extent seasonally there. But they're going to have to get a bit serious about it if they don't want to be left behind. And then as far as cities go, yeah, you can't provide all your energy needs with rooftop solar, right? Especially if you live in an apartment. But you don't have to go that far out of a city to find enough land to put solar panels down. So like even Singapore, which is a very densely populated state in a relatively modest solar abundance area because of clouds and weather, seasonally it's fine. It's the same year round, but there's a lot of clouds and stuff. If you put solar panels on the roof of every building in Singapore, you would produce more energy than it currently consumes.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And there's no way that Singapore could be energy self-sufficient. So anyway, that's my answer to that question. It's very unintuitive, but solar is so much more productive on a per acre basis than agriculture, which is the reason that the AIs will end up paving our farms to feed themselves. That you end up even in a place like France or Germany, you could produce all the hydrocarbons they could ever want with a single-digit percentage of their land, and like something like 20 to 40% of all land is essentially unused, unoccupied, uninhabited, like swamps, deserts, mountains, all that kind of stuff. Like Japan, for example, famously energy poor country, is like 2/3 mountain forests. You could put solar panels on 10% of that, and it would have more energy than it knows what to do with. Alrighty, it's been a pleasure. I've got to run. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
Bye.